A good friend. That's how one of the DOJ prosecutors previously tasked with investigating Hunter Biden described his relationship to the president's son in never-before-seen emails. This, according to the Washington Examiner, which also found that several prosecutors handling the Hunter Biden investigation are Democratic donors.
The unraveling of the original sweetheart plea deal and the Department of Justice's subsequent promotion of David Weiss to special prosecutor has the Justice Department's even most sympathetic analysts scratching their heads. Let's check in on CNN's read on this.
It's really inexplicable to me. I mean, first we had basically 5 years of behind-the-scenes investigation with no transparency, no action, and some questions being asked. What's taken so long? But in the last couple months, we've seen a pattern here, and Marshall just laid it out. We've now seen it play out 2 or 3 separate times. DOJ moves towards a very lenient disposition. They're just about to lock in that lenient disposition. And then there arises pressure, either through whistleblower testimony or through public scrutiny. And then DOJ backs off and says, actually, we're not going to do that now that it's been called out. We're going to try to up it a little bit. And then that happened again. And then they go all the way to appointing special counsel, the same guy who's been presiding over the case for 5+ years already. So I genuinely am perplexed by what DOJ is doing here. I think they've made a real mess for themselves, and now they're going to have to deal with the consequences of it.
Yeah, 100%. So it really did seem to be some combination of the whistleblower testimony and the fact that the judge just put her eyes on it and had looked at it with scrutiny and said, this doesn't make any sense. Because the core expectation seems to have been that no one was going to look twice at the broad immunity in the deal. And the presumption was, and the New York Times Daily podcast laid out the facts in a way that I thought was very clear. It's worth listening to. That the trade-off was going to be that Hunter Biden avoids a trial and embarrassment in exchange for the plea deal, and also immunity. But that isn't a fair trade-off. What you would presume is that, okay, Hunter Biden doesn't have to go to trial. Joe Biden doesn't have to have the exposure of his son going to trial. That's that. But then to loop in the idea that you're never going to be culpable for this year's worth of stuff that is still under investigation, frankly, that is about his potential bad,
right? It is still under
in
investigation. That's what the judge asked, and they said yes. So she said, how could we close this off in the midst of an investigation?
So at that point, what's so interesting, and what the New York Times kind of walks through, is there's still ostensibly value in Hunter Biden signing a plea deal that still is pretty lenient on the gun charges and the tax charges, but still leaves him open to the
influence peddling, Briahna, et cetera.
Exactly. But he seems to have not felt that way. And there's a shift that says, well, it's all or nothing.
Right.
In a way that now has put the Bidens in a situation where Hunter's own interest in fighting this to the end is radically at odds with Joe Biden's interest in putting this to bed and not having to be personally implicated in this if this goes to trial.
Right. In fact, because they've tried to say they'll put Joe Biden on the stand as a witness for the defense. Hunter Biden will. And you, Justice Department, don't want that to happen. Justice Department ran by Merrick Garland, an appointee of Joe Biden, who's ultimately looking out for his best interest, whether he admits it or not. You don't want that. So, and they don't want that. And David Weiss seemed, despite being a Republican Trump appointee, seemed to be really down with that, really wanting to. I mean, this deal is wild, and that's why he's lost the faith of Republicans, and that's why questions are being asked whether his team was more Democratic leaning, whether he had some personal friendship here with the Bidens.
I mean, honestly, one of the possibilities that was raised in this Times report was that Weiss was being pressured in the same way that when we're talking about the Twitter files, it turns out that some of the bad actions are just they were pressured by the government. And maybe you think they should have had more integrity and stood up and thumped their chest and whatever. But that part of why he might have demanded special prosecutor status is to get more protection from the Biden administration and the DOJ and more independence to conduct the investigation that he really wanted to conduct in the first instance. That is a possibility. But it's still, it does make the kind of choice of the whistleblowers to come forward more interesting in light of Weiss's choice not to say anything publicly about the potential bias, the obvious bias in the situation.
And what he suggested is at odds, of course, with what the whistleblowers from the IRS, Shapley and the other fellow, have said about the course of the investigation that it was stymied by the Justice Department, that he was not given full license to pursue it in whatever direction he deemed fit. And Weiss has kind of said that's not the case, but it's unclear and it's ambiguous. And then at the end of the day, the proof's in the pudding, right? The deal was wild.
Although I will say that the whistleblowers, correct me if I'm wrong, their emphasis seemed to be on the idea that Hunter Biden should have had to suffer worse consequences for the tax crimes. Not that the sweetheart deal itself is fundamentally biased because it provides broad immunity.
They contradicted what David Weiss had said about having full authority to prosecute the case. They said that was not true and that he was stymied by the Justice Department. That was the most revealing of the things they had to say.
Sure, but I feel like a lot of that testimony was about whether or not it was, prosecutorial discretion was advised in choosing to land where they landed on the crimes, on those specific crimes. And I do think that's a little bit different. I do think there's a credible argument that having a plea deal, generally speaking, on the terms that were decided was fine, except for the broad immunity. And it does seem like it was the broad immunity being taken out that scuttled the deal in court the day that they were supposed to sign this thing. Not
an immunity that specifically cited Burisma by name.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It is.
Here we are.
It is notable.
It's so wild that even like a mainstream media, a legal commentator who wants to go to bat for the Biden administration can't defend it.
Yeah, I don't know what they know or want in their hearts, and if they're big Biden boosters or what have you. But certainly, I think that they don't. The liberal media in general doesn't want to do or say anything that would empower Donald Trump. And the reality is that now we're in territory where a voter can plausibly believe, whether or not I would believe it or judge these things to be equal, they can plausibly believe that they're both leading candidates on both sides of the aisle are facing significant legal exposure, and that I'm therefore going to choose to vote on the basis of my principles and not on anything involving either of these cases. So to the extent that Democrats hoped that Donald Trump's multiple indictments were going to be damaging to him, vis-a-vis Biden, who seems like a person with integrity and is above it all, that is all out the window.
Yeah. And that it impacts how one perceives Joe Biden. To think that, again, the calls that he participated in, the dinner he attended, and the decision he made that he bragged about, the foreign policy decision with respect to Ukraine and the judge that benefited Burisma, the company his son is being paid monthly for working for, that ultimately led to Trump's impeachment. That's something, I'm sorry, that's something voters are going to want to hear about, learn more about, and possibly take into effect as they judge. And of course, so many people in the mainstream media want to compare and say, well, it doesn't compare to all the crimes Trump has committed. He's going down for them.
Yeah.
They're convicting him. They're prosecuting him, likely to convict. What can you say?
There's an interesting parallel here where the criticism of Trump from liberals since 1/6 has been, you stood up at the podium and you told them to do an insurrection, and AOC's life was in danger and all of that.
They impeached him for it. They voted not to remove him from office.
Right.
It's over.
And on the Republicans, and that didn't penetrate the conservatives at all. That would seem to be like a bad faith attack.
Yeah. Well, some Republican senators voted to remove him from office, but
the
more than ever before in human history.
It didn't rattle his base in the least. And on the other side, Republicans have been, many of them, Hunter, drug addict, Burisma. But what I think in both cases has helped it to penetrate the national consciousness on the other side of the respective aisles for both of these instances is a level of detail that perhaps the public wasn't trusted with. So instead of just focusing on the day of 1/6, actually having these indictments that now get into what the actual alleged conspiracy was days and weeks before to issue these false slates of electors and pressure local election officials to change the election results. Well, that seems like a lot more credible and something that is more difficult to excuse. On the other hand, having evidence that there was actual bias within the Justice Department, whistleblowers coming forward, including someone who, people, a Trump person now, seemingly implicated in the bias, but also now wanting to have a special prosecutor status to potentially go after this more closely, more forcefully. I think that also starts to penetrate from a factual matter into the liberal consciousness, and so it seems like something other than just a conservative conspiracy theory.
This is the Hunter Biden saga is another one of those cases where it was initially derided as just this is totally crazy. Yeah, misinformation. Don't look at this. You're being tricked and lied to by propagandists, maybe Russian, and look where we've come since then. I mean, this is why people end up in a place where they don't believe anything they read in the New York Times or mainstream outlets, even though now those outlets are starting to do some perfectly decent reporting on this situation. It was just the blanket dismissal of a just asking questions mindset. So it's not wrong to just ask questions. Not all questions lead you to productive places or are lines of inquiry that make any sense or are in good faith. But the narrow lanes of inquiry that are imposed on us by establishment thinkers are extremely narrow and are missing a lot.
Yeah, is Joe Biden in up the proverbial creek either way here? Even we talk about if he goes to trial, then Joe Biden could have to testify, and that's bad. But even if he doesn't go to trial, I mean, Hunter Biden's argument, people believe that he feels he's so exposed to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has made such a case of going after him endlessly for political reasons that he doesn't want to take a plea deal that still leaves him vulnerable to that if Donald Trump gets back into office.
I mean, Hunter can always hope here that there's going to be Trump might not win the election.
Sure.
Even if Trump does win the election, he can hope, that there's going to be no follow-through, that this was really about the campaign.
Which, by the way, Donald Trump was president for 4 years and talking about investigating Hunter Biden and didn't get this far.
Or appoint someone exactly like David Weiss who looks at it, gives him a plea deal. So it's not the end of the world. I mean, the reason this is being so front and center is, frankly, it's about the election.
Sure.
If Donald Trump were to win the election, whether he cares so much about closing this loop, that remains to be seen.
Yeah. I mean, now that the broad immunity is off the table, it just really does feel like they're all exposed. Whether you take a moderate plea deal, whether you go to trial, it does seem like a very mucky situation for Joe Biden, and I don't envy it. I wonder if we're going to start to see a pivot where there is more of a distancing between him and Hunter Biden, because it hasn't happened to this point.
No, it hasn't, and he's maintained he has no knowledge or involvement in any of his son's business dealing. We'll see how well that assertion holds up and how it looks in the face of what we've been reading and reporting and talking about. More Rising right after this.